Everybody uses steel.
That's how it's gonna be.
I don't have, I gotta miss the Viking state, right? You know, we use steel. No, it's, no, I got Nazi parents. Up and down, yeah.
Well, if I could call this meeting to order, we have a quorum and we have the Zoom people and some of them in place already, so we'll go ahead and start. Next couple of weeks are going to be kind of fun because we're looking at all the genres in the Bible. We're saying that before you start reading in the Bible, you should try to determine what genre you're reading. So you're not reading narrative as though it's a poem, or a poem as though it's a narrative, or so on, because it'll cause you to misunderstand. Because each literary genre has its own characteristics that you have to understand before you understand what's going on. Poetry is a great example of that because poetry is symbolic in a certain sort of way. So you have to know that and not always take everything you read in a poem literally. But sometimes people will read a passage in the Bible that is a poem and they'll read it literally and therefore come up with some very strange ideas about, well, it says it in the Bible. Well, yes, it says it in the Bible, but it says it in a poem in the Bible, so it has to be read as a poem, and so on. We've talked about that a lot before. But anyway, we're down now because of wonderful planning on the teachers' parts. We're right toward the end of this series. We're doing the end of the world sort of thing. Anyway, the topic for the next 2 weeks is going to be apocalyptic, and we'll split it into this morning. Apocalyptic in the Old Testament and next Sunday apocalyptic in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. What I'm going to do this morning is just sort of introduce us to this whole idea of apocalyptic. I want to start this way. To me, the best way to start with trying to understand apocalyptic literature is to jump to the 20th century and to think about going to see or watching on your little screen a science fiction movie. And I want to take all three of those words. I'm tempted to make a whole oration out of this, but I won't. Science and fiction and movie, because all of them help you in understanding apocalyptic. In science fiction, you take the world in a real scientific way, but you sort of crank it up a little bit, okay? So the science is just a little bit ahead of where real science is. Or things are working a little differently in the world than the scientific world that we know is. So things happen that don't happen in our regular world and so on. And another interesting thing about science fiction is there, great stories and exciting stories and lots of, drama and blood and all of that kind of thing. But also a lot of them have very serious point they're trying to make about something. And it's often, it takes something that's real in our own culture and then expands it into something that becomes horrible. And it's the author's way of saying, if we keep doing this, we're going to be in big trouble. So there's a kind of looking forward, a warning to people and so on. The other thing about the movie part of it, the reason I think it's not just like a science fiction novel, the apocalyptic is, you have to always think when you're reading apocalyptic literature, it's like you're looking at a big screen. You went back to a theater, to an old time movie, and it had a wraparound screen, and you're watching all of these things happening on the screen. It's very visual. And even though it's written down, and you might think, well, what we're talking about here is a scroll or a book. No, we're really talking about what we would call a movie. It's things are happening. There's a lot of color, there's a lot of sound. So the author is doing all this on purpose. They have, it's a type of literature in which you do this. Just like if you're writing a biography, you write one way, but if you're writing a science fiction novel, you write another. And sometimes people get worried about, I've had people come around to me and say, if I understand what you said, you're saying that the Bible is science fiction? And I said, no, I don't think you're understanding my point. First place, a lot of science fiction, even though it's fiction in the sense that it's not something that literally ever happened, but it's about things that are really real. They're as real as they can be, and it's making a point that's as real as it can be. So anyway, kind of keep that in mind. I'll bring it up again maybe. The other thing is just the word itself, which it's really two Greek words, and you put them together, and it it means what happens when you again are in the theater and they draw the curtains. Okay, that is the apocalypse. The apocalypse is not the end of the world. I know we use the word that way now, so I guess it's okay as a modern English word. But the word as it's used in the ancient world is it's not the end of the world. It's what you see when they pull back the curtain. So now let's think about going to see a science fiction movie in a theater, and when they pull back the curtain, I don't guess they do that anymore, do they? When I was a kid, when we went to the theater, even a movie, they had real curtains at the front that they pulled back before the movie started. I hadn't thought about how old that idea is. But anyway, so when the curtains pull back, that's the unveiling, that's the apocalypse. And then you see what happens when they pull back the curtains. So, apocalyptic literature has certain kinds of characteristics, just as science fiction does. You can always tell, sometimes they'll fool you. You get into a science fiction movie and you're 30 minutes into it, and you think everything's okay, and then something really weird happens that doesn't happen in our world, you know. And you think, oh, this is science fiction. You identify it immediately. Well, anyway, one of the, and not all apocalyptic literature has all of these things. I'm just mentioning some of the aspects of it. Somewhere in it, it is religious literature because God is in it somewhere. And the main event, the drama in it comes from divine intervention. Okay. It's when something from up there, from the other world, inserts itself into this world. That's when you know you're reading not just a historical account, you're reading apocalyptic material. There's also usually a rescue. There's somebody in big trouble, and there's divine intervention to rescue them. Okay. So, and again, I'm just talking about in general. You won't find one place where all these things are true, but it's also very highly figurative. Now, I'm picturing it to you visually, but they had to write it down. Okay, so they do this by means of figures. It's not, I'll come back to this in a minute, but it's not code, exactly like code, although ancient people often understood what these figures meant. They were ways of expressing something, and you have to use and appreciate a huge amount of imagination when you read apocalyptic literature. Try to see it. That's why I suggest try to think you're sitting in a theater and you're about to see this great movie, high budget, okay? Because it'd be very expensive to put this in a real movie. There's almost always a celestial revealer and somebody on the earth that they're revealing this story to. And it's very interesting to study that too. It's not like God is revealing himself. It's like somebody from up there, so to speak, has come from God to tell someone a story or to show them things or to pull back the curtains in some way. Of course, I guess Revelation is next week, right? But you see that in, John, who has this angelic visitor. Almost always an apocalypse or apocalyptic literature has somebody that gets a visit, it's usually from an angel. And they begin to tell them things. I've been thinking some this week, but I won't go down this rabbit hole. But it's interesting, that in Islam, the Quran, which is not an apocalypse, but it's a very unlikely guy getting a visitor from the other world, and then giving him the words that become the Quran. So in that sense, the Quran is kind of apocalyptic in the way it happens. So you got a celestial revealer, you have a human recipient, and then the other thing that's very important about one of the other things very important about apocalypses is there's always, or almost always, I say always, a current situation that's triggering it. Okay. People have just got to get rid of the idea, and you can listen to religious programs on TV and you hear this all the time, that somehow the apocalypses are written for me. You know, in 2024 in Malibu, that some 2,000-year-old apocalypse was written exactly for me. So if I can find something in it, it's probably a code for what they're doing down at LA City Hall. I hear people talk that way all the time. But the apocalypse is triggered by something that's happening to its first readers, okay? You have to start from there in order to really understand what's going on in the apocalypse. Otherwise, you will get really wild ideas, which people do all the time by reading this kind of literature, because they're not reading it like it was an apocalypse. They're reading it like it was a coded letter sent directly to them from God, and that he's trying to tell them a secret that nobody else knows, you know. So to say that I will reveal the meaning of the apocalypse is, what is that? I think redundant would be the word. The apocalypse is doing the revealing. You're not. You're not going to be able to tell people something that the apocalypse is not by reading it. So then you have people in trouble. You have someone coming to someone and explaining the situation and telling them, giving them comfort in the situation. And almost always the comfort they give is to say, I know things are really bad, but believe me, they're going to get better. And in fact, and I know evil seems to be winning, but I will guarantee you that eventually good always wins. You get that idea over and over again in apocalyptic literature. Now, this stuff came from, it starts, well, I don't know that anybody knows where it really starts, but you begin to see it, a lot of it, in the 2nd century BC, between the time the Old Testament was written and the New Testament. So there's a little bit of apocalyptic, and we'll be talking about some of that this morning. It's sort of concentrated in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, and in a few places in the prophets, where you'll have a section, maybe a chapter or two, that is apocalyptic. And in fact, I think probably the whole idea of apocalyptic came from some of the really ancient prophets who would often sort of let their imagination run wild when they'd say, and God is going to rescue us. And when he does, the stars are going to fall. And the ocean's going to go dry. And, you know, and they would start to talk in this huge cosmic kind of way, which was just simply a way of turning up the volume, you know, and saying, I mean, this is going to be something. And the moon will turn to blood, you know. And so this is not astronomy, okay? This is apocalyptic. And this is the way of stressing something in the greatest possible verbal way. And you begin to get that in the Old Testament prophets sometimes. Amos saying, the day of the Lord, when the day of the Lord comes, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. So that's sort of the beginning of what becomes apocalyptic. Now, of all the genres in the Bible, I think this is probably the most challenging and maybe the most misunderstood, partly because there's so much figurative language in it, and that figurative language is so strange. And it calls on so much imagination and trying to see these things in your mind, that people really get lost in the weeds very often. And particularly if they think it's a code of some kind, if they can just break the code, they'll find out something that nobody else has ever found, or they'll find the true meaning and so on. So many of these figures, you know, the dragons, the stars falling, the colors, the people wearing the white robes that shine, all of these kinds of things were very, very commonly known to somebody in, say, Paul's day. It was imaginative to them, but it was not something that they had never seen before or didn't know about. Jews had been writing and reading apocalyptic books for at least 200 years before Jesus came. So it's kind of important if you're going to understand the symbols in apocalyptic literature to see what they would have meant to somebody in the day when the book was written, because it was written for those people to understand it. So if you get hold of their understanding, you'll get hold of the understanding today. There are a lot of Jewish apocalyptic books in what's often called the Second Temple period, the period when after the Jews had come back out of exile, between the Old and the New Testaments, and then into Jesus' day. Let me just read you some titles, see if you've ever heard of any of these or read any of these books before. There's the Book of the Watchers, which is great. It's a part of another book. It's a part of Enoch. There are the Similitudes of Enoch. There's Second Enoch. There's the Book of Jubilees. There's Fourth Ezra. There's Second Baruch. There's the Apocalypse of Abraham. There's the Testament of Levi, the Testament of Abraham, the Testament of Moses, and I could go on. Mm. And these books were fairly widely known and read, even in Jesus' day. The people that Jesus is teaching, at least the somewhat more educated ones, would have known almost all of these books, and probably have read some of them or heard them or heard stories from them, because they're also just good stories sometimes in addition to what they teach. Now, very quickly, let me just give you some of the characteristics to look for when you're reading an apocalypse. The first place, you'll notice almost always that the person who gets the message, the human recipient, gets it in a dream or a vision. This is the way it comes. Okay. It's visual from the very beginning. Read it and look at it. Don't read it as words. Read it as a movie. Okay. That's why I stressed that at the very first. Because that's the way they got it. I was in the Spirit in the Lord's day, John says, and then he begins to see things. He sees visions. It's like I always imagine it like this. He looks into the sky, and the sky becomes this huge wraparound screen, like in a big theater, and things begin to happen up there, and he's watching them. And then the angelic here's the way it happens. It could be John, it could be any of the apocalyptic writers. They're just going about their business. This angelic visitor comes to them and says, "Watch this," and they pull this veil, and it opens, and the whole sky is like a huge screen, and he begins to see these things. And then sort of after he's watched it all through, the angelic visitor says, "Now write this down." And so what we have is the person writes down what they have seen in this huge thing that they've seen going on. So you see an apocalypse. You don't read it, you see it. The other thing is that almost none of the apocalyptic literature is written by the person whose name is put on it. Did you notice when I was reading that list of books, the Testament of Abraham, the Testament of Moses, the Apocalypse of Abraham, Second Baruch, Second Enoch, these are names we know, but I think very few people in history have ever thought, including the original readers, that these were the people who actually wrote these books. But this is part of the genre. Okay, this is what you do. The interesting thing about, to kind of get a little ahead, the interesting thing about the book of Revelation is it apparently is by somebody that we have their actual name. That's very unusual in apocalyptic literature. It's usually some heroic character from the past who is written into the script as being the person who's getting the message.
I'm going to write a book on you, John.
So we've got, I think you call that pseudonymous, right? It's pseudonymous. It's the author is part of the imagination, and the person is mentioned as the author. And then you have this pervasive symbolism. Everything is in symbolism, but it's not symbolism that's meant to hide. It's symbolism that's meant to build up your sense of imagination. It's the use of imagination. To kind of jump forward to the last thing I was going to say is theologians appeal to the rational part of you, and they give you theological truths in a rational fashion spelling it out, pretty specifically and with actuality. An apocalypticist wants to say the same thing to you, but he wants to get at you through your imagination. He wants you to see things. So to see a little lamb that was slain about to be eaten by a monster, and to see somebody step in and get, well, there's a lot of theology in that, but it's highly symbolic. And so remember that that's what's happening. But the symbolism is meant to teach you, not to confuse you. Or it's certainly not meant to give you a secret that nobody else knows. In fact, it's supposed to be an unveiling, not a veiling. Okay. We could say more about it, but that will show up in some of the text. Let me just quickly give you 5 or 6 themes that you tend to get over and over again. You get angels. There are lots of angels. Which stands to reason, because it's what angels do. They bring messages from the other world to this world. There's dualism in the sense that history is seen as not just history, the whole cosmos, the whole universe, everything exists is one huge battle between good and evil. This is very typical of the way the apocalypticist sees the world. A huge battle between good and evil. There is the sense of, I'll call it limited determinism. We know how it's going to come out, but we don't know exactly the part everybody's going to play in it. So everyone still has their free will, even within a world where it's like, I know the end of the story, but my part in it is up to me. This is the way. So people are told they should do this or should not do this, or people will be punished for what they've done, or they'll be rewarded for what they've done. And they're being told these things in the context of saying, here's what's going to happen, and then this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen. So it's a kind of limited determinism. Then also there's an imminent crisis. Almost every apocalyptic book was written when somebody somewhere who's supposed to read this is in real bad trouble. They're in really real trouble. They're being persecuted for their faith, or another nation is about to sweep in and massacre them. There's something like this that triggers it. There is an imminent crisis. And then another theme that you almost always get in apocalyptic literature is the faithful remnant. Don't be worried if there are 100 evil people for every one good person. Almost all apocalyptic literature will say, that's right, that's true. Evil always appears that it's outnumbering good, that it's more powerful than good. And so that's always going to be the case. But, says the angelic visitor to his recipient, that's not true, because eventually that one person is going to turn out to be right, and the 100 are going to turn out to be wrong. So there's the faithful remnant. And then finally, there's divine judgment, in which there's the last intervening in the battle, the cosmic battle between good and evil, is when God eventually says, okay, that's it. That's enough. The end. So now we're at the end of the movie, and God steps in, and justice is done, and wrongs are righted, and everything goes back to the way we all think it ought to be right now, do we not? You don't have to watch the news much to say the wrong people are suffering, evil people have more power than good people. Those are ancient concerns, conundrums with the human race. And the apocalypticist comes along and says, yes, you're absolutely right, but in the end, good will prevail. Good will overcome evil. And that's why you get like in the book of Revelation, this beautiful thing at the end about the streets of gold and the gates of pearls, and the angelic host singing Handel's Messiah. At least that's the way I always thought of it. And so that's apocalyptic literature. I don't know.
Wow, thank you. I grab.
Yeah. A lot of traffic up here.
Yeah, I know. Jam. All right, so to explore Apocalyptic for today, we're going to look at Daniel 7. So if you want to open, I didn't print out anything today because the printer wasn't working for some reason. So Daniel 7 is where we're going to be. We're going to read it through pretty thoroughly, actually. Apocalyptic in the Old Testament is interesting because similar to some of the other genres we're talking about, the Apocalyptic is couched in other genres. So Daniel is a prophetic book, but it's also highly narrative oriented. So like stories like Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, Daniel's buddies who are also in Babylonian exile, and the story of Daniel in the lion's den, those kinds of stories are in Daniel as well. And then you get Daniel 7, and Daniel 7 is apocalyptic, kind of inserted into prophetic narrative, and in some ways too, Daniel's prophetic voice comes out as apocalyptic literature. So all these genres that we've talked about, for those of you who've been here for many or all of the weeks of the last semester, all of these genres kind of come together, a lot of genres kind of come together in Daniel. So before we read Daniel 7, a little bit of context. Daniel and his friends, we know them by their Babylonian names, not their Hebrew names, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. They're all from the Davidic line, the line of David, and they're part of the Babylonian exile. So Babylon has taken over Jerusalem, taken over, the land of God's people, and they killed a lot of people. So there was a lot of slaughter that happened, but there were also a lot of people that were taken into exile in Babylon. And in Babylon, the God's people had to make really hard choices. They were not supposed to follow their dietary laws, so a lot of Torah. They were supposed to bow down to idols, and they had to make choices of whether they were going to risk their lives and be faithful or not be faithful and survive in this new land. And different Jewish people, different members of God's people made different choices at that time. But Daniel and Meshach and Shadrach and Abednego, they all are examples of what it looked like to live in faithfulness. And they were among some who were not martyred, who were not killed for their choices, but that God intervened in order to reveal God's self to God's people and give them hope, and also to the Babylonians, and especially the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, in order to humble him. So that's where we are in Daniel. Daniel chapters 2 through 7 are actually written in Aramaic. So if you've always heard like the Old Testament is written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and you're like, where is this Aramaic? Well, some of it is in Daniel, and only part of it is written in Aramaic. Aramaic was one of the common. It's a sister language to a cousin language, I guess, to Hebrew, a very common language in the ancient world. And so at this point in the story, we've already seen Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego thrown into the furnace, and they come out alive, which, that's crazy. Daniel has already interpreted a couple dreams for the king, which is a little different than apocalyptic, because the king was having dreams and then Daniel was interpreting them. So it's a little different than like an angelic divine being revealing oneself. But clearly some interesting things going on already in this story. And then we get to Daniel 7. This is immediately following Daniel coming out of the lion's den unharmed. So we're going to read, I'm going to just go ahead and read pieces of it and stop to notice some things. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Belshazzar is the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. Then he wrote down the dream. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. So we talked about how apocalyptic is soaked in symbolism. The Great Sea is one of those that appears in the very first verses of Genesis 1 and shows up throughout the rest of the Bible. Genesis 1, the Spirit hovers over the chaotic deep, the waters. So the waters, the ocean, the seas remain a symbol throughout, all the way through like the end of the New Testament, remain a symbol of chaos, of darkness, of disorder, where God needs to intervene and bring peace. Okay, and verse 3. I'm reading out the NRSV, by the way, in case anyone wants to read the same version. And four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. So the beasts are emerging from the chaotic waters. The first beast was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I watched, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being, and a human mind was given to it. Another beast appeared, a second one, that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side, had 3 tusks in its mouth along its teeth, and was told, "Arise, devour many bodies." Okay, so we have lion bird thing that turns into a human. And now we have a bear walrus thing that is invited to eat everything. Okay, verse 6. After this, as I watched, another appeared like a leopard. The beast had 4 wings of a bird on its back and 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this, I saw in the visions by night a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. So you can imagine this beast like rampaging through, humans and devouring everything in its path and then trampling the remains under its feet. This 4th beast was different from all the beasts that preceded it, and it had 10 horns. Horns were a symbol of kings in the Old Testament very consistently. So a horn was like a king. So there's something here now that these beasts are being connected to imperial power. I was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little one coming up among them. To make room for it, 3 of the earlier horns were plucked up by the roots. There were eyes like human eyes in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. So this 4th beast has all these horns on its head. So this 4th beast is like an amalgamation of rulers. And one of the horns comes up, and then there's like a little mini beast on the beast. And the horn has like eyes and a mouth. Man, Daniel, you're seeing stuff. So Daniel has these 4 beasts so far in his, before we move on. Daniel has seen these 4 beasts. There's these 3 kind of micro beasts, so they're all very scary. And then there's the giant super beast. So that's one way of thinking about that 4th beast, the most important beast, the super beast with the 10 horns, including 1 talking horn. I like this too, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. I'd be interested to know what that mouth was saying, but we never get to find out. As I watched, thrones were set in place. And an ancient one, or in other translations, the Ancient of Days, took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. So God is enthroned on a throne mobile. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. So this is a very common visual in a lot of the prophets, in a lot of the Old Testament, and in a lot of apocalyptic literature, where God enters the scene as a judge, ready to proclaim judgment upon the situation. So you have these 3 beasts, and then this 1 super beast, and then God comes in on a flaming throne on wheels with tens of thousands of attendants, and it essentially takes the seat, the judge's seat, and is ready to proclaim judgment on what is happening. I watched then because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. So this horn is still blabbing away while God enters the scene. And as I watched, the beast was put to death, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, the 3 smaller ones in the first part, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. In other translations, it says a time, times, and half a time. We don't know what that means. Prolonged for a season and a time. As I watched in the night visions, I saw, so I'll pause there before I read that. So we have God now who has entered the scene, has proclaimed judgment. The super beast, the scariest of all the beasts, is killed and destroyed. And the other three beasts, for some reason, their power is stripped from them, but they're alive. Like, so we don't know yet what exactly that means. I saw one like a human being. Does someone else have a different translation there?
Son of man.
Son of man. Sound familiar? This is where Jesus gets his favorite name for himself. I saw one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And this Son of Man came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. To him, the Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. So this Son of Man language in the New Testament, in the Gospels, is this really interesting, rich name. It literally means human being. Does anyone know the word for human being in Hebrew? It's in Genesis. Adam, yes, that's where we get the name Adam. But what it really, the word is, it's not actually a name. It's actually Adam, which means human being. And it's the same word in Aramaic, Adam. And so what it says is I saw one like an Adam. It's a human being. It's like almost like this Son of Man is like the epitome of humanity, like humanity come to fruition. And so this Son of Man is brought to the side of the Ancient of Days and is given rule over all of the over all the earth. What's interesting here is kind of what John was saying at the end there, where it looks like evil has won, right? These four beasts are so powerful. And we know that they represent imperial power. They represent, the ways in which humans turn into beasts when given power, and how it happens over and over and over again. And especially when it comes to empires and kings, people who are given like ultimate rule, authoritarian power, how it is just inevitably corrupted. And even humans turn into beasts. So we see that there in those early beasts who like the feathers are plucked off and they become like a human being, or the horns that represent kings, which are human beings. So this Son of Man character comes in as a human being, but doesn't transform into a beast. And that dominion is extended onward. Okay. All right, so then Daniel has an interesting interaction. As for me, Daniel, this is verse 15, my spirit was troubled within me, as mine would be, and the visions of my head terrified me. I approached one of the attendants. So Daniel's in this vision. Have you ever like been in a dream? I have these a lot where I like realize I'm dreaming, and then you'll like be like start testing people in your dream. I have those quite often. So Daniel does that. He's like, this is disturbing, and he goes up to one of the attendants in this dream, one of the attendants to God, and says like, nah, what's going on here? All right, so Daniel approaches one of the attendants to ask him the truth concerning all this. So he said that he would disclose to me the interpretation of the matter. So an interaction with an angelic being. As for these four great beasts, 4 kings shall arise out of the earth, but the holy ones of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. It's a pretty brief interpretation of a really dense, highly symbolic dream. So 4 kings shall rise out of the earth, but God will give dominion to the Son of Man, and goodness will prevail, essentially. Then I, Daniel, desired to know the truth concerning the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. And concerning the 10 horns that were on its head, and concerning the other horn, which came up to make room for which 3 of them fell out, the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke arrogantly and that seemed greater than the others. As I looked, this horn made war with the holy ones and was prevailing over them until the Ancient One came. Then judgment was given for the holy ones of the Most High, and the time arrived when the holy ones gained possession of the kingdom. So he's asking this angelic being, what does this part mean? Because this part's super weird and you didn't explain it. This is what he said. As for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth that shall be different from all the other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom, 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. This one shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, shall wear out the holy ones of the Most High, and shall attempt to change the sacred seasons and the law. And they shall be given into his power, for a time, 2 times, and half a time. There it is again. Then the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and totally destroyed. The kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. Here the account ends. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly terrified me, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter in my mind. Super weird dream. Why does it matter? You know, John just said, like, this isn't written to us, and that is really important. We've talked a ton in this class, as, you know, in all good Bible classes, that context really matters. Why, as people, Christians, in 2024 in the US, why should we read a weird old dream of a guy who dreamt a dream when living in the Babylonian Empire as an exile more than 2,000 years ago? Like, why does this matter to us? What does this have to say to us? What are some guesses? Thoughts? I don't necessarily really have an answer besides, like, it's scripture and it matters for that reason. Yeah.
Well, to me, the truth of this story is absolutely true for us as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that evil will be defeated.
Yeah.
You know the final outcome. And when you get caught up in the battle and you're getting trampled or you're getting eaten or whatever, you think you're losing. But the story says that if you're on God's side, you are on the side of victory.
Thank you. Yeah.
And that is the truth.
Yeah.
It was true then, it was true now.
Yeah, a huge, I'll elaborate on that a little bit. A huge piece of this is hope, right? Like, the Jewish people had just lost their land, had just lost their temple, like their temple where they encountered God. They're living in a foreign land. They're watching many of their, you know, brothers and sisters, their fellow Jews, like, choose to, like, well, I'm going to survive, so I'm going to do what I can to survive. And that meant worshiping idols and abandoning Torah. And they're watching their kids grow up in an empire. Like, it's been decades at this point. Like, hope feels pretty distant at this point. Like, they have experienced the super beast. Like, the super beast is here and eating them right then. You know, like, this isn't like some future thing or some theoretical thing. Like, this is, I mean, they're experiencing it right now. They're watching people die to keep, you know, the laws of God. Like, this is brutal. And so this is a word of hope. Yeah. That in those moments where all seems lost, and even when in our lifetimes we don't experience the things being made right, that there is hope for the future, that you know, the revelation will continue, and look, the victory is had by the Ancient of Days.
So it was a political, economic climax that was just beginning, but the people of Israel, it was starting from Israel. So God was telling Daniel, said, look, this is the beginning of this whole thing. This is the movie. It started from Israel here. And this would be the king that would come after, and this would be this that would come after. But at the end, I will still be in this thing, and I will still be the solution to this thing.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
That's what we're still living in today. So
yeah, like, I think this dream gives hope, and a lot of it we can read the symbolism as, like, the Babylonian Empire, right? The Babylonian Empire, you know, but also, like, this symbolism of humans turning into beasts when the ends justify the means, when greed and self-servingness and self-preservation become the ultimate goal, when our values are not to you know, we, as Christians, we would use the language of Christ-like. Of course, that'd be foreign to Daniel, but as Christians, we would use that word. And so this one human comes in and doesn't turn into the beast. And instead rules as, you know, and is given everlasting dominion as a human. Yeah, Stacey?
Question and then a comment. So it looks like from reading the story that the first three beasts were holy beings endowed by God. It sounds like that at the end, right?
I see
what they're referring to, and that's why they stayed around, because they weren't human beasts. These were holy creatures, but they got defeated for a while, and then they came back, and God is still doing that. Is that? I mean, I know this is all apocalyptic.
Yeah,
and
that's a good
I won't read too
question.
much, but is that right?
Yeah, I mean, at least in the translation here, I don't know what the original Aramaic has, but in the translation here, it's all passive verbs of who is giving the dominion, of who is giving the power. It's all passive verbs. So it's not really clear how these beasts came about, and if they were like, were they humans given power by God and then they were corrupted. That's what we see in the Davidic line over and over again. People who were, you know, King David was good and pure as a shepherd boy, and then he's given power and then he becomes corrupted. And you know, we see that happen over and over and over again in human history, in the story of God's people and in human history. So is that what's happening, or are these beasts that came to power in other ways? And I don't know. Was that your question?
Kind of.
Yeah.
It's just interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, if others know, I haven't stumbled across that. Yeah, if that's more certain. Do you know, John? Do you have a different answer to that?
Well, not specifically, but I can say in general that the plot can be put down on any period in history. You can substitute instead of a lot of scholars say that what really is being described here is Alexander the Great and the empires that were created after the time of Alexander the Great. But there's apocalyptic is not really doing chronology. And that's, again, people who try to interpret when the world is going to end by reading passages like this think that they're reading chronology. But the point's not chronology. The point is that you can substitute your own evil beast, right? Whoever you want to put in the story, and the point of the story remains the same. So if you want to say it was Stalin and Hitler, well, okay, I don't think Daniel meant it was Stalin and Hitler, but the point of the story would be the same if you told the story and then described Stalin and Hitler instead of these particular beasts and so on. So you know, almost always in the apocalyptic, there are people who certainly never lived to see good overcome evil. Like in the book of Revelation, it talks about all the saints who had been killed for their faith. Well, when they died, things didn't look too good. So we got here is an overall picture. Name your own villain, but know that whatever villain you mention, he's not going to win. So, but I think to your question there, I've seen a lot of scholarly commentaries on this passage will identify every one of these beasts with some Hellenistic king. But whether that's the case or not, I don't know. But sometimes it does kind of fit a little bit. And say, oh yeah, well says the one with 10 horns. Well, there were 10 Hellenistic emperors, and you know, you find little things like that. And I do think that Daniel and John Revelation and others, they do have specific historical things in mind, but they're not playing a little game with you saying, you know, can you guess who this is?
Yeah.
The point is that the evil guys are going to lose to the good guys.
And the reason I asked is, I'd always thought they were all evil or human, or those spirits of the things we don't want to live into, rather than the spirits of the things that we do want to live into as followers of God and followers of Christ. But if they are, it's just interesting because all of this is so much about awe and about seeing the things we don't know, and being allowed to see fully whatever the opposite of like not a holy awe that gives you that holy fear, but the terror of real destruction and real bad things. And so if there's so if those are the more of the spirit, those other three are endowed with the spirits of things that are scary but are of God. Watch them bound up by a human thing for a while and not know, like, that's just a different thing, because it's important to see God is always in control and he's always going through, but sometimes the very things he does in design get back up by something for a while, and they will come through, and even that's not the end. God is even over those. So it just gave it a different feel, so that's what I was asking.
There's a kind of progression of the growth of evil in the story. I mean, each one of these gets worse than the other, and it finds, and then there's gonna be this one, and boy, this one is really bad. You know, it sort of builds like that.
Mhm.
That's why I wondered, is it progression of evil, or is it seeing things we don't like and understand about God's justice because we're human and it feels harsh to us? What is that? I'm not denying love and that God wants, but just in this story, this apocalyptic story, because it is so discouraging to see something where you thought justice was coming and then it just gets smashed
Got
down.
worse,
You think, is it
yeah.
even real? I mean, it's like last week when we walked through Jesus dying and they're just bereft, they thought that was it. So this feels like that moment to me. Sorry, I don't need to spend a lot of time on it. I was just like, what is this? Which does it mean? Because they're different and they're both important.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that it's symbolism, you know, parsing out, like, are they, you know, how do these beasts relate to God? Like, might be getting into the weeds a little too, it might be like challenging the metaphor a little too much, or challenging the symbolism a little too much, where it's like, or stretching it, maybe not challenging it, but stretching it a little too far. Because this is meant to be, not that it's bad questions. I love good questions like that. Those are really good questions. And we want to be conscientious that we're not like decoding it too, of like, of that this is a dream that is representative of a pattern of what happens over and over again in history, and the details might look different at different times.
I was thinking about Daniel's prayer life, and how interesting, you know, like we know Daniel to have been consistent 3 times a day in prayer, and I'm assuming that was a lifelong thing, you know, and I think it's interesting to think about like the relationship that he had with God, that in this moment culminates in this really creative, if you will, like expression of hope, you know, from a very creative God, giving a very creative, you know, it doesn't feel hopeful. Hope feels really far away, and there's hope, you know.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and the hope might be really far away. Later in Daniel, and we can kind of end here. Later in Daniel has another interaction with an angelic being, and he looks back at Jeremiah and he says, you know, according to Jeremiah, like, this is going to last 70 years. And he's like, so we're almost done. And the angelic being says, like, God's people have continued to rebel, so it's actually going to be 7 times that. And Daniel is just like, are you kidding me? Like, this wasn't long enough? Like, we have been, like, this is horrible. And had just received this dream of hope of like, this is gonna be. So I mean, even Daniel was like, geez, man, all right. And Daniel didn't see it come to fruition. He didn't see the hope be fulfilled ultimately. But he stuck to his guns. I mean, he was saved from the lion's den. He was lifted up and became an advisor to the king of Babylon, even though partially because he remained faithful to the Torah and to God. And like, that's, you know, but he never saw it ultimately come to fruition. He wasn't part of the return to Jerusalem, and he just had to trust, but he died not knowing. Yeah.
Your reference to the 70 reminds me, something we certainly need to talk about a little bit next week is numbers. I mean, actual numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 numbers, not the book of numbers. And because a lot of the speculation about apocalyptic stuff comes from people, the way that people treat the numbers. So anyway, we'll do a little numbers thing next week. Talk about that.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. For guests, thanks for coming on a genre day that was like the hardest of all the genres. So thanks for being here. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.